judge will eventually decide which parts of it will be tossed out because the Supreme Court has granted presidents broad immunity from prosecution. The case is being heard as Trump is locked in a tight race with Vice President Kamala Harris. Trump has said he will accept the results of the November election if, quote, everything's honest. That remark concerns election watchers, among them Rick Hasson, an election law expert at UCLA and director of the Safeguarding Democracy Project. Rick, what scenario in this election concerns you most as somebody who watches how elections are run?
Well, there's lots of things that could go wrong before Election Day or on Election Day. There could be violence at the polls. There could be problems with voting machines. We worry about these things, unfortunately, all the time. I'm most concerned in terms of the aftermath of the election. There may be a period where we don't know who's president. There may be an attempt to try to delay or change the results in some states.
So let's go to that first. I mean, what's the possibility that, as has happened before, we may not know on election night who the winner is, which means a voter goes to bed seeing that somebody's in the lead and wakes up to seeing them losing. What's the chance of that?
Well, the chances are pretty good if the election comes down to Pennsylvania or Wisconsin. And the reason I single out those states is because those states have not made a change to their election administration rules that allow what's called the pre-canvassing of ballots. This is essentially checking mail-in ballots to make sure that they are ready to be counted, that they've been signed, they've been correctly filled out. All of this is something that happens in advance in most states, including in many red states like Florida. That's why we get Florida's results usually by sometime late that evening. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, it's been on the agenda, but Republican legislators have resisted making changes to those rules. And so we did have a situation back in 2020 where Trump was ahead in Pennsylvania on election night because more Democrats voted by mail and those ballots took longer to count, and eventually Joe Biden won the state. We didn't know that until the Saturday after the election.
So in North Carolina, for instance, mail-in ballots are going to go out tomorrow. This is the first in the nation to be sending them out, and the new rules stipulate they have to be received by election night to count instead of 3 days later. So there's no uniformity right now among the states on this. I also want to ask you about what Republicans have called a precinct strategy to send attorneys and volunteers to the polls to flag any kind of irregularity they believe that they see. Describe how that would work and whether or not you think it might cause problems.
Well, let me first pick up on your point from before, which is that we don't have uniform rules for any of this stuff. So in every state, there are different rules as to who's allowed to observe, whether they need to have training, how it's supposed to work, where they're supposed to stand, and all of that. This is not the first election where Republicans have said they were going to send observers to the polls. We can go back to 2004 when this was a big issue in Ohio. A case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. 5 o'clock in the morning, Justice Stevens was asked to issue an emergency order. So this is not new. Lots of times these things don't materialize. I think most election officials are prepared for whatever's going to happen in the polling places in terms of observation, in terms of people coming to the polling places, and there are rules in place. So I'm not overly concerned about these attempts. And remember, lots of people are going to be voting early, in person, in many states. And so we'll get a sense of what the plans are well before Election Day.
Tell us some of the other things that have been installed now as safeguards that you think might protect us from some of what happened after the 2020 election.
So my biggest concern is the post-election period. In 2020, there was the attempt to try to change the electoral college results in a number of states through litigation, through political pressure and hearings, claims of fraud. That path, the fake electors path, has been mostly shut down in part through a law that Congress passed at the end of 2022 called the Electoral Reform Act. It does a number of things. For example, it says the vice president can't simply fill out votes that she doesn't like, and that states can't simply substitute their vote choice for the choice of the legislature, things like that. But, you know, everything depends on people following the law. The good news from last time is that there were responsible Republicans and Democrats in positions of power who did the right thing, and I hope and expect that we would see the same thing in 2025.
Do you have faith in the election system, and do you think voters should?
I think that the election system, almost entirely in the United States, is well run. It is decentralized, it is partisan, so it has some flaws in terms of how easy it is to make sure that things are done right everywhere. But there's been a lot of paid to how elections are run. There have been a lot of upgrades of both machinery as well as training of election officials. If we look at 2020, that was an election that was run under very difficult circumstances in the middle of a pandemic. It was very closely examined because of Trump's claims of the last election being rigged. And I think all of the evidence shows that the election was fairly run. So I think voters should have confidence that the election is going to be fairly run. That's not a reason to lose vigilance, fail to pay attention. But I think so long as everyone is doing the right thing and people are watching to make sure they are, we should be in good shape.
Thank you. Rick Hasson is an election law expert at UCLA and director of the Safeguarding Democracy Project. Nice to speak with you.
It's great to talk to you.
Now, more than 60 million Americans are under heat advisories today as blistering heat waves scorch parts of the western United States. Temperatures in the southern regions here in California, Nevada, and Arizona are climbing and expected to be well over 100 degrees. And in the Pacific Northwest, Portland is expected to hit a rare 100 degrees today. Ian Livingston is the weather and climate reporter for the Washington Post. Ian, welcome. Now, I'm wondering, some places will see temperatures between 115 and 120 degrees. Phoenix just hit a record 100 straight days of 100-degree weather. Put those numbers into some kind of real tangible terms for us. Can you go outside in that kind of heat?
Sure, and thank you for having me. I think you want to definitely limit your outdoor activity during heat as hot as you just talked about. 115 to 120 will mostly be in the desert areas, but even in Phoenix, where they are quite used to heat, as you noted, they've had now 102 days in a row of 100 plus, and that is a record for consecutive days by over 3 weeks, and still no sign of it ending. So even there, it's pretty unusual.
So who's most vulnerable, say, in Phoenix to this extreme heat for a prolonged period?
Right, I think particularly the young and the elderly. You want to check in on sort of any neighbors that you might not know if they have anybody else checking in on them in particular.